The letter from the title company arrived on a Tuesday morning, and it was addressed to me as a courtesy copy because my name was on the original deed as a secondary heir, and because title companies send courtesy copies to secondary heirs as a standard procedural step that most secondary heirs receive, glance at, and file without reading carefully. I read it carefully. I read it the way I read everything that arrives in an envelope from a legal or financial institution, which is completely and with attention to the specific language of each clause and the implications of each disclosure and the questions raised by each piece of information that is present and the questions raised by each piece of information that is absent. The letter was a preliminary title report for a property transaction. The property was the house at 1847 Maplewood Drive in Decatur, Georgia, the house where my father Raymond had lived for 31 years. The house where my mother had died in the upstairs bedroom in 2018. The house that I had helped my father maintain for 6 years since my mother's passing, and that I had helped him navigate the question of what to do with for the last 2 of those 6 years, as his health had declined, and the house had become more than he could manage alone. The seller named in the preliminary title report was not Raymond Osei. Raymond Osei was my father, and my father had been in a memory care facility since March and was not in a legal position to sell anything without the involvement of his designated power of attorney. The seller named in the preliminary title report was Marcus Osei. My brother, my name is Diana Osei-Bonsu. I am 61 years old. I was born in Decatur, Georgia, the older of 2 children born to Raymond and Gloria Osei, who had come from Ghana in 1971 and had built a life in Atlanta over 50 years with the discipline and the dignity and the long patience that people bring to the building of lives in places that do not always make the building easy. My father had worked as a civil engineer for the city of Atlanta for 33 years. My mother had been a registered nurse for 28 years and then a nursing educator for 8 more. They had raised 2 children in that house on Maplewood Drive, bought in 1993 for $112,000 and paid off by 2009, and they had done it with the same attention and consistency and love that they brought to everything. I grew up in that house. I did my homework at the kitchen table. I learned to cook in that kitchen. I sat on the back porch with my father on Sunday mornings and listened to him talk about the projects he was working on and about Ghana and about what it meant to build something carefully and to leave it in better condition than you found it. My brother Marcus was 3 years younger than me and had grown up in the same house with the same parents and had absorbed different lessons from the same material, which is the mystery at the center of every family that produces 2 children from the same source and watches them become different people. My father's decline began in a way that declines of that kind begin, gradually and then suddenly, the way Hemingway described going broke, incrementally and then completely. The first signs were small, repeated questions. Misplaced items, a confusion about dates that was easy to explain as fatigue, and that became harder to explain as it became more frequent. By the summer of the year before the letter, I was making the 40-minute drive to Maplewood Drive every weekend and sometimes twice a week to check on him and to handle the things that had stopped being manageable. The mail, the medications, the bills that were going unopened because opening mail had become a task that required an organizational capacity that was no longer reliably present. My father had been a meticulous man his entire life. The disorder that was developing in his house was not the disorder of a man who had stopped caring. It was the disorder of a man whose mind was no longer supporting the habits that his character had always maintained. I brought this to Marcus in the fall. I told him what I was seeing and what I thought it meant and what I thought needed to happen. Marcus came to Maplewood Drive twice in October and agreed that our father's situation required a more formal care structure. We agreed to pursue an assessment. We agreed to explore care options. We agreed on the power of attorney question, which was the most significant legal matter and which required careful handling because our father was still in a sufficient state of cognitive function to participate in the designation if we moved quickly. We moved quickly, and a state attorney named Caroline Webb was engaged. Our father was assessed by a geriatric physician. The power of attorney documents were prepared and executed in November. Marcus and I were named as co-agents with equal authority and with the explicit provision that major financial decisions, defined as transactions over $50,000, required the consent of both agents. I have that document. I have always had that document. It was the document that Marcus had either forgotten about or had decided to act as if did not exist. I do not know which. Both are serious. I want to be fair about Marcus because fairness is a discipline, even when it is personally inconvenient, and because Marcus was not born a man who would sell his father's house without his sister's knowledge. He became that man through a combination of financial pressure and the specific erosion of judgment that financial pressure produces in people who do not have the habit of seeking help before the pressure becomes a crisis. Marcus had made choices over the preceding decade that had created financial obligations that his income did not comfortably support. A house he had bought at the top of his budget in 2015. A business venture in 2018 that had absorbed capital and produced losses. Credit obligations that had accumulated in the way that credit obligations accumulate when income is not growing as fast as expenses. I knew some of this. I did not know all of it because Marcus had always managed the presentation of his situation the way men who are embarrassed by their finances manage it, by controlling information and projecting confidence and deflecting specific questions. What I understood in the weeks after the letter was that Marcus had looked at the house on Maplewood Drive and had seen $480,000 at current market value, and had made a decision about that number without consulting the co-agent requirement in the power of attorney documents or the estate attorney who had drafted them or his sister, who had been driving to Maplewood Drive twice a week for 18 months. He had found a buyer. He had engaged a real estate attorney who had either not reviewed the power of attorney carefully or had reviewed it and proceeded anyway. He had initiated a transaction that was approximately 11 days from closing when the title company sent me the courtesy copy that he had not anticipated I would receive. I read the letter at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning. By 8:40, I had called Caroline Webb. Caroline was the estate attorney who had drafted the power of attorney documents and who therefore had the most direct professional knowledge of what the documents said and what the transaction Marcus had initiated represented in relation to them. She picked up immediately and I read her the relevant sections of the letter. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Diana, the co-agent requirement is explicit and it is not ambiguous. A transaction of this size requires your consent. It has not been obtained. This transaction cannot close without your signature and your signature cannot be obtained without your knowledge." I said, "I am aware of that, Caroline. I want to know what I can do today." She told me. The first thing she could do was contact the title company directly and inform them of the co-agent requirement and the absence of the co-agent consent. Title companies have a specific obligation when they receive notice of a potential defect in the authorization for a transaction they are processing, and that obligation is to stop the transaction pending resolution of the defect. Caroline sent the notice by 11 that morning. The transaction was paused. The second thing she could do was file a formal objection with the county recorder's office to any deed transfer for the property at 1847 Maplewood Drive that did not include documentation of both co-agents' consent. She filed that by 2 in the afternoon. By 3 o'clock on Tuesday, I had, with Caroline's professional assistance, placed 2 separate legal stops on a transaction that was 11 days from closing and that Marcus had been counting on completing before I was aware of it. I was already 3 steps ahead. I had been 3 steps ahead since 8:40 in the morning. I did not call Marcus until Wednesday morning because I wanted the legal structures to be fully in place before I had the conversation, and because I wanted to have the conversation from a position of complete information and complete preparation, rather than from the reactive position that a Tuesday morning letter had temporarily placed me in. I spent Tuesday evening reviewing the full picture of my father's situation with the documentation I had, the power of attorney, the asset inventory I had been maintaining since my father's assessment, the current market appraisal of the house that I had commissioned 6 months earlier as part of the estate planning process, and the preliminary title report that had started the morning. By Wednesday morning, I had a clear and specific understanding of what Marcus had done and what it would have produced and what I was going to do about it. I called Marcus at 8:30. He answered with the voice of a man who had already received a call from the title company and knew that the transaction had been paused and was probably expecting my call and dreading it. I said, "Marcus, I received a courtesy copy of the preliminary title report for Maplewood Drive." He was quiet. I said, "I want you to tell me when you were planning to tell me." He said, "Diana, I was going to tell you." I said, "When?" He said, "After the closing." I said, "After the closing." He said, "I knew you would object." I said, "You were correct that I would object. You were incorrect to believe that proceeding without my consent was an available option. It was not an available option. The power of attorney document is explicit. Caroline drafted it. You signed it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I need that money, Diana." I said, "I know you do. That does not change what the document says." The conversation on Wednesday morning was the beginning of a series of conversations that extended over 3 weeks, and that produced a picture of Marcus's financial situation that was more serious than I had understood, and that explained the decision he had made in the way that context explains decisions without excusing them. Marcus's house was significantly underwater relative to its market value. because of a refinancing he had done in 2021 at terms that had not been carefully enough reviewed. The business venture had left him with personal guarantees on obligations that were currently being pursued by two creditors. The credit obligations were at a stage that was approaching the threshold where legal action becomes the creditor's preferred tool. The $480,000 house on Maplewood Drive had looked to Marcus like a solution that was close enough to reach that the risks of reaching without proper authorization had seemed acceptable. I want to be honest about what I felt when the full picture became clear. I did not feel only anger. I felt the specific grief of seeing a person you grew up with having become someone who could look at the number on a house where your father lived for 31 years and see it primarily as a solution to his own problems. That grief is its own kind of loss, and I am not going to pretend it is not present in this story, because it is present and it is real, and it is part of what the situation cost even after the legal structures had been correctly applied. Caroline and I spent 4 meetings over the 3 weeks after the paused transaction, building the full legal response to what Marcus had attempted. The first element was a formal amendment to the power of attorney that added specific procedural requirements for any real property transactions, including a mandatory written consent process and a waiting period that would prevent the kind of rapid transaction Marcus had initiated. Both Marcus and I signed the amendment. Marcus's signature on the amendment was, in Caroline's assessment, significant because it was an acknowledgement within a signed document that the original co-agent requirement existed and had been operative at the time of the transaction he had initiated. The second element was a protective order on the Maplewood Drive property registered with the county recorder that would flag any future attempt to initiate a transaction without the documented consent of both co-agents. The third element was a formal accounting of my father's assets and the management of those assets since the power of attorney had been established, conducted by an independent fiduciary appointed through Caroline's recommendation. The accounting was clean, everything was where it was supposed to be, nothing had been misappropriated. The house transaction had been stopped before it closed and the stop had been clean. The fourth element was a restructured estate plan that reflected my father's actual wishes as Caroline, and I understood them from the conversations we had had with him in the months before his cognitive decline had progressed to its current level. Conversations that Caroline had documented in writing at the time specifically, because she had understood that documentation of expressed wishes would be important later. Those documented conversations established clearly that Raymond Osei did not want the house sold during his lifetime. He had said it in several ways across several meetings, and Caroline had written it down. Marcus had known this. He had been present for some of those conversations. I asked for a family meeting. I asked for it formally through Caroline with written notice and an agenda and a request that Marcus bring his own attorney if he wanted to. He brought his attorney. Caroline and I were already at the conference table when they arrived. The meeting lasted 3 hours, and it was the most difficult 3 hours I have spent in a professional or personal context in recent memory, and I have had some difficult hours in both categories. Marcus's attorney presented a framing of the situation that emphasized Marcus's financial need and the family's collective responsibility to address it, and the argument that the house was an asset that would eventually be distributed between the two heirs anyway, and that an early realization of that value was not fundamentally different from a post-estate distribution. Caroline addressed each element of this framing with the specific and documented counter that the co-agent requirement and my father's documented wishes established. Marcus sat through most of the meeting without speaking, and when he spoke it was with the specific quality of a man who has been caught doing something he knows he should not have done, and who has moved past denial into a kind of exhausted acknowledgement that is not yet an apology, but is the material from which an apology can eventually be made. I presented the full picture of what I had done since Tuesday morning: the calls, the notices, the legal stops, the formal amendment, the protective order, the independent accounting. I presented it not to humiliate Marcus, but because the meeting required the full picture to be on the table, and because the full picture was the only foundation on which anything honest could be built going forward. When I finished, Marcus looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked at me. He said, "You were ready before I even knew you knew." I said, "Yes." He said, "How?" I said, "Because you were not the only person who had been thinking about that house. My father was in the memory care facility on Peachtree Road, and he did not know about any of this." His world had contracted to the specific geography of his floor and the familiar faces of the staff and the photographs on the dresser in his room and the Sunday morning visits that I had not missed in 6 months. On the Sunday after the family meeting, I sat beside his chair in the common room, and he was having one of his clearer days. the kind of day that memory care families learn to receive as gifts rather than as the return of something that will stay. He talked about the house. He talked about the back porch and the Sunday mornings and the garden that my mother had maintained along the south fence and that I had been maintaining since she passed. He said, "Diana, don't let them sell that house while I can still come home to it." He said it with the clarity of a man who was fully present in that moment and who knew what he wanted. I held his hand. I said, "Nobody is selling that house, Dad." He said, "Good." He said it with the satisfied finality of a man who has delegated something important to someone he trusts. I drove home from that visit and I sat in my car in the parking garage for a few minutes. I thought about the letter from the title company and the 8:40 call to Caroline and the 3 stops placed on a transaction in the time it takes most people to finish a second cup of coffee. I thought about my father saying, "Don't let them sell that house." I had not let them. I was not going to let them. That was the job and I was doing it. Marcus's financial situation is serious, and it was serious before the Maplewood Drive transaction, and it will require addressing through means that do not involve our father's house and that do not involve decisions made without proper consultation and consent. I am not without compassion for the situation he is in. I am his sister, and he is the only sibling I have, and the house on Maplewood Drive is the place where we both grew up, and the fact that his desperation had reached a level where that house looked primarily like a number is something I understand even as I reject the action it produced. We are in a place of careful and structured engagement. Not warmth, not yet, but the kind of honest and formal interaction that can produce something warmer eventually if both people do their part. Marcus has signed the amended power of attorney. He has cooperated with the independent accounting. He has not initiated any further action regarding the house. His attorney has been professional and has not attempted to relitigate the stop transaction. These are the behaviors that rebuild trust after it has been broken, and Marcus is exhibiting them, and I am noting them, and I am keeping the door open at the width that is appropriate given the last 6 months, and that I will widen as the evidence warrants widening. Caroline reviews the estate documents quarterly. The protective order on the property remains in place. The independent fiduciary submits monthly reports. The house on Maplewood Drive is still the house on Maplewood Drive, and my father can still come home to it on the days when coming home is possible. And on the days when it is not possible, the house is still there waiting, and that is what he asked me for, and that is what I have delivered. I want to be specific about what 3 steps ahead actually means because it is in the title, and because it deserves to be explained precisely rather than left as a phrase. The first step ahead was the power of attorney document itself and the co-agent requirement within it. I had pushed for that requirement specifically in November when Caroline was drafting the documents. Marcus had been agreeable about it at the time because the requirement had seemed theoretical rather than operational, and because agreeable was the posture he had adopted for the estate planning conversations, while he was still working out what he was going to do with the information those conversations produced. The co-agent requirement was not luck, it was deliberate. I put it there because I understood that significant decisions about my father's assets required a structure that prevented unilateral action, and that the structure needed to be in the documents before the moment when unilateral action became tempting. The second step ahead was the asset inventory and the market appraisal I had commissioned 6 months before the letter. When the title company letter arrived, I already had a current and documented picture of the property's value and its place within the broader estate. I did not need to scramble for information because the information had been maintained. The third step ahead was the relationship with Caroline Webb. 18 months of working together on my father's estate had produced a professional relationship where a call at 8:40 in the morning produced meaningful legal action by 11 and formal protective filings by 2 in the afternoon. That relationship did not exist because I called Caroline on Tuesday morning. It existed because I had been building it since November of the previous year, with the specific understanding that the moment of crisis is the wrong time to establish the professional relationships that address it. I had 3 steps ahead because I had taken 3 steps ahead before I knew I would need them. That is the only way to be 3 steps ahead. You cannot catch up to 3 steps ahead from behind. You can only get there in advance. I want to speak to the people watching this who are the person in their family who handles things, who shows up, who drives to the house twice a week and manages the medications and opens the mail and makes the calls that nobody else is making, who has been managing a situation that others are aware of but not engaged with, and who has wondered whether the management is sustainable and whether the protections are sufficient and whether the structures are in place for the moment when someone decides to test those structures. I want to tell you that the structures matter more than the concern, and the concern matters more than the hope, and the documentation is the thing that makes all of it real in the moment when real is what you need. Write down the conversations. Engage the attorney before you need the attorney. Put the co-agent requirement in the document when the document is being drafted, not when the transaction is already in progress. Commission the appraisal before the letter arrives. Build the relationship with the professional before the crisis requires the relationship. Do all of it quietly and without announcing it, and without creating conflict where conflict is not yet necessary. Be 3 steps ahead before the first step is taken against you. That is the job. That is what showing up actually looks like when you do it correctly. My name is Diana Osei-Bonsu. I am 61 years old. I grew up in a house in Decatur that my parents bought in 1993 and paid off in 2009 and maintained for 31 years with the discipline and the dignity that they brought to everything. My father sat on the back porch on Sunday mornings and talked about building things carefully and leaving them better than you found them. My brother looked at that house and saw a number. I looked at that house and saw what my father asked me not to let go of, and I was not going to let it go. The title company letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday morning, there were 2 legal stops on the transaction, and by the end of the week, there were 4 protective measures in place. And by the end of 3 weeks, there was an amended power of attorney and a registered protective order and an independent accounting and a restructured estate plan and a family meeting that had produced the beginning of something honest. My brother had no idea I was already 3 steps ahead. He had no idea because the 3 steps ahead were quiet and patient and built over 18 months before they were ever needed. That is how you protect what matters. Not with drama, not with confrontation. With preparation and documentation and the professional relationships that turn preparation into protection in the 11 minutes between reading a letter at 8:15 and making the first call at 8:40. My father is on Peachtree Road on his clearer days remembering the back porch and the garden. The house is still there. I am still driving to check on it. The job is not finished. The job is never finished. That is fine. I know how to do the job. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already. There is always more to come.